Wellcome Trust. So with funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we responded to the challenge of workforce training. So with the call to increase manufacturing and self-reliance in vaccine development, we identified that there was heavy reliance on vaccine imports, supply chain vulnerabilities, limited access to vaccines during crisis, for example, the COVID vaccine. And our objective was to invest in local talent and manufacturing capabilities so that we can improve vaccine accessibility, reduce dependency on imports and other markets, and create job opportunities. So our approach to tackling this issue is three-pronged. We engage people still in academia by offering career webinars, which last year we offered 4 of them. We also run a Vaccinology course, a master's level, which you are the participants of. And we also do on-the-job apprenticeships through collaborations and partnerships with different manufacturing entities, where people can go and get hands-on experience from anywhere between the range of 3 months to 12 months. So on that, we've had one successful one with IVI for 6 weeks, hands-on training in adenovirus vaccine manufacture. And we have one coming up with Hilleman Labs in Singapore, where we will have 6 apprentices stationed there for 12 months. So the primary initiative that we're here on is the Vaccinology in Africa course, which is an initiative run by Oxford, University of Oxford, which through our funding, they have graciously allowed us to run this for this year. So this is the 7th offering. There have been 6 previous ones, one being virtual after COVID in 2021. And this is now the next one after the online offering. So we've had 40 participants that were shortlisted to attend. 6 were not able to come, but 34 plus 1 were able to be here. Plus we included some 2 participants from the Kenya Veterinary Vaccine Manufacturing Division. And most of you are master's level and above, and you're all African residents, which is the part of our mandate in terms of reaching out to increase local capacity within the continent. And our team is small. So we are led by Professor George Warime, who unfortunately is not here with us, and then myself and Caroline, who you've been interacting with. And our funders are the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Jenner Institute. So I'll stop there and introduce the next speaker, who is Adrian Hill. He's a professor at the University of Oxford. He's also been named one of the Times 100 most influential people in health. And he's been a professor in vaccinology at the University of Oxford. He's a consultant physician in infectious diseases, a fellow of the Magdalen College in Oxford, and he's a leader in the field of malaria vaccine development, as you're all familiar with the R21 vaccine, which he spoke about earlier in the week, and also was a co-leader in the research team, which produced the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine, along with other professors from the university. So let me welcome Professor Hill.
Good morning. Great to see you all, particularly on a public holiday. And fantastic to see this course thriving just over 10 years since it was founded. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about the role of academia in building a sustainable vaccine ecosystem. Some people would think that's an odd title because a lot of people think academia is there to do fundamental research. I don't agree. I think we're there to do translational research. I think we have a role. I'll try and make that argument. And I'll show you 2 slide decks, one fairly high-level overviews of what I think we should be trying to be doing globally. And secondly, specific examples of what we've done at the Jenner Institute, which was founded in 2005. So we've had a little bit of time at this game. So in the old days, and I mean the very old days, around about 1900, it was pretty straightforward what you had to do to make a vaccine. And all you could do was isolate the microbe, very often a virus, polio or whatever, rabies. So identify the pathogen, learn how to grow it. If you couldn't grow it, then you had a problem. You couldn't grow your vaccine. Crucially, inactivate it. So if you're doing polio, you're not giving people polio, you're giving them a vaccine. And inject it with or without an adjuvant, usually without an adjuvant, because a lot of microbes have immunostimulatory molecules that act as adjuvants. And some of our best vaccines are still made in this way. We're stuck with the ones that don't work when you try to do this. This was tried with malaria, for example, many, many, many decades ago, and inactivated malaria vaccines don't work, sadly, so it's been harder. This is sometimes called the inactivated pathogen approach. It's one of the predominant ways of making veterinary vaccines, which is why veterinary vaccines need specialized facilities. You're lucky to be near Ketavapi. But the key problem with this approach is that you need biocontainment. You can't have poliovirus floating around your environment out of your manufacturing facility. You need very, very stringent containment so that nothing leaks and gets out into the environment. Now, this worked to a degree for COVID-19. So the Chinese vaccines like Sinopharm and Sinovac were made in this way, and China has very good containment facilities at a very large scale, and of course, over 1 billion people to vaccinate just in their own country. But the problem is you can't really predict two things before you know what the virus is, and that's bad for pandemics. You don't know how well it will grow, and if it won't grow well enough, you have a problem. Your yield will be low, you won't make many doses, and you don't really know the virulence of a pathogen and how safe it will be. And of course, preparing by building a high containment manufacturing facility that you might never use is not something I would recommend to most countries. So it's not the ideal solution, it's not the best solution. Subunit vaccines in the last 100 years have come to the fore, particularly when you can't grow the microbe. And they're less expensive to manufacture than these inactivated viruses. So if you're an academic and you go to your vice chancellor and say you need a biomanufacturing facility with containment that will cost $300 million, good luck, not likely to happen. Right, so what is the problem being an academic making vaccines for the world? Well, there are lots. Firstly, you are competing with big pharma who do this at real scale with thousands and thousands of people who are very, very good in-house and specialized in all areas of vaccine design, development, manufacture, and particularly marketing. I don't know any universities that are good at marketing their own vaccines. There aren't too many of them. So the general problem for us academics competing in that space is that big pharma has much larger resources, and I don't mean many millions, I mean many billions to spend every year. So they have people who are very, very good in R&D and manufacturing. They have the money to buy your vaccines, which might be what you want, and to develop them further, to develop a good manufacturing process, and to sell these vaccines at what I would call a relatively high price. So if you have a look at the price of, say, a Moderna or a Pfizer COVID vaccine compared to what we were able to do with the AstraZeneca partnership, the vaccines were much, much more expensive when a big company like Pfizer was involved. AstraZeneca was unusual. They agreed to our requirement for global health use. So what about biotechnology companies? You're much more likely to co-found a biotechnology company than a big pharma company. So these are smaller. Their advantage is they tend to be founded on new technologies which you might invent. You might be a founder, you might be a shareholder. You will need patents because you won't have a company or investors if you don't have patent protection of your new idea or your vaccine. And that's also the limitation. The company has to be built around whatever the intellectual property is, and they tend not to own other things. So biotechnology companies are important. Very often they're a step on the way to licensing to big pharma, but they're also high risk. Many fail. In fact, to be honest, most fail. Not so much because the technology fails, but because it takes longer and they run out of investors' money. Now, both of these types of company would like large markets, ideally global distribution, and will need to charge moderate to high prices, not so much because the technology is expensive, but because their investors want a return on investment. So immediately you can see that in academia, we don't need that return on investment. We beg or borrow money from philanthropists, from governments, from anywhere we can find it. We generally don't have to pay it back, but in industry, you do. So there are real differences here between those settings. So trying to summarize on a slide what I see as the role for academia in vaccine development, we have more time. You might find that surprising, but if you're going to work on, say, HIV vaccine development, you're far better off not being in a company. Because after 3 to 5 years, the chances are you will not have made an HIV vaccine, and nobody has, after decades. And then the investors walk away, and you don't have a job anymore if HIV is your thing. Malaria is somewhere in between. It's taken arguably 100 years, and it's been hard. We don't have other parasitic vaccines, except now 2 for malaria. But industry does tend to quietly cancel a program if you're not making progress. So we have the advantage of many of us being in jobs for many years. So we can have a longer time horizon and take on some really important but difficult tasks. As I said just a moment ago, developing lower cost vaccines because we don't have shareholders to pay off. So you can only sell vaccines at $1 or $2 a dose if you're firstly manufacturing at great scale, and secondly, don't have to pay a lot of money back. And for many markets, including particularly in Africa, you have to have sensibly priced vaccines or governments won't be able to afford them. So thirdly, developing vaccines with lower supply requirements. We don't need to be able to sell millions of billions of doses. In fact, ideally for outbreak pathogens, you might want to be able to vaccinate the first 10,000 people around an outbreak, but very quickly. So you don't need the manufacturing scale for some of these indications. And finally, undertaking high-quality clinical trials. This is the traditional home of vaccinologists in hospitals and in universities around the world. Much, much easier to raise money from companies who've made the vaccine and want you to do the clinical trial than it is to design the vaccine, develop the vaccine, manufacture the vaccine, take it into the clinic, keep it going into phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and find a partner, commercial partner, to develop it. But that is what I'm going to talk about now, because you know about doing clinical trials, and companies will come to you, particularly if you're in the right setting, and ask you to be partners. The challenge we're talking about today is designing your own vaccine, or what I would generally call preclinical vaccinology in academia. And I'm often asked, what do you need to do to be able to set up a serious vaccine activity in a university? How much does it cost? How long will it take? And what facilities will you need? So let's have a go at that. Vaccine testing. Let me wake a few people up. Hands up those of you who have immunized a mouse, ever, anywhere. Not seeing a lot of hands. Well done. It's pretty basic. You need animal facilities if you're going to design your own vaccines and test them. Yes, you can design the vaccines, you can make them, but you have to persuade somebody that they do something useful, like possibly protect even an animal, let alone a person. So relatively few very high quality animal facilities that meet modern regulations in many African countries. So preclinical animal immunogenicity models are, in my view, essential at a starting point. Generally in mice, if you're rich, maybe in macaques or other non-human primates. If you're a veterinarian, a little easier. Livestock are more accessible, but much more expensive than small animals. And then if you're an immunologist, or you can find an immunologist to work with you, you look for an immune correlate. Why is that important? Because you might like to know what immune response you want in your phase 1 trial. If it's as good as it is in an animal that's protected, that's quite encouraging. But more than immunogenicity, you would like to have an animal efficacy model, and that can be difficult or can be very easy. In malaria, where I work, you need an insectary, certainly for pre-erythrocytic vaccines. That's tricky. Not everywhere has an insectary, and acquiring one might be quite expensive. For outbreak pathogens, you might have the containment problem, so challenging with the real pathogen, which may not even infect mice, might be difficult. So those are the two key animal requirements and what I see as a starting point. Then you need to choose your vaccine type. Most people don't have too much difficulty with that. People come into the field because they think this sort of vaccine looks new and exciting. This year, it's mRNA vaccines. 20 years ago, it was DNA vaccines. Just making the point that because there are no DNA vaccines licensed, the newest technology isn't always the best, even though it's often the most exciting. The top line there, DNA, peptides, replication-competent viruses, you don't hear so much about anymore. 25 years ago, they were state of the art. Proteins and multimerized proteins in nanoparticles are probably the go-to immunogen and have been around for years, but they need adjuvants. And viral vectors have become prominent in the last 10 years, particularly in the COVID response. So you need to choose a technology. It's hard to do all 4 types. You don't need to, but you need one that's right for your pathogen. Then adjuvants for protein-based vaccines. There are well-known adjuvants around like emulsions, like alum. More potent ones like saponins have come to the fore in the last few years. You need to be able to access those adjuvants in some way, often from other companies that may be happy to see you use their adjuvant for your project. Then toxicology studies in small animals, we don't do those in-house at the Jenner Institute, we outsource them. They're sensibly priced if you go to the right place and done to a very rigid standard. And then if you're really ambitious, you might want to have your own GMP manufacturing facility. We stumbled across one, I'll come back to that in a moment. It is really helpful to have. I'm sometimes asked, is there anything left to do? There are so many vaccines on the market now, 30 I heard at the last count. Well, the good news and the bad news is that there's lots more to do. We have a TB vaccine, it's not great. TB is killing huge numbers of people every year. Much better TB vaccines are needed. HIV, we have nothing. Dengue, very tricky. Vaccines made, one withdrawn, difficult. Malaria, well, there are 2 malaria vaccines. They're both for falciparum, which is the most important species. We have nothing for the others. Outbreak pathogens you've heard about already, and there will be more outbreak pathogens that I can't put on the list, known as disease X. HCV and HBV, it's often ignored that hundreds of millions of people are dying of hepatitis B. Yes, we have a good vaccine to prevent it. We don't have a good vaccine to treat it. And that's beginning to look feasible. And I sometimes tell the students that in their lifetime, the young students, they're going to see most lectures on vaccines being about therapy, immunotherapy, after the prophylactic vaccines have been largely made. But we're missing lots, Group A, Group B streptococcus, that would be good to have. Staphylococcus, the big companies have left. It would be great to have a staph vaccine. It's been tough, E. coli, etc. And then going on to the non-infectious diseases, Alzheimer's disease, monoclonals beginning to look good. If monoclonals can work, vaccines can probably work. They'll be a lot less expensive. Watch out for that. Cancer, very tough, because you don't make good immune responses in cancer to your own antigens. I think that's going to take time. Obesity, probably much sooner. So there are now monoclonal antibodies to keep you thin. Expensive. If you had a vaccine, you might stay thin for longer or less expensively, but I'm not recommending that as a priority, and so on and so forth. So to summarize, the facilities are obviously labs. Most people have labs, but you might need high containment labs. Expertise in and facilities for design and production of at least one modern vaccine technology. We worked on DNA-based vaccines for years. That was helpful. We became good at that. Small animal facilities, a lot of people have. High quality immunology. I don't think you can do vaccinology without immunology and immunomonitoring. And then you have the option of doing more things. Bioinformatics, you might find a pathogen biologist who's a colleague and who's all about your microbe. That would be helpful. Structural biology, you can probably outsource. Clinical trial capacity can be done in-house, or you can outsource it. And field trials are the later stage when they tend to present themselves. You know, we know the good places to do a malaria vaccine trial now. There are plenty of them. And to save money, and this is not an inexpensive game, it really helps to have critical mass. If you set up on your own and you're the only person doing vaccinology in your university, it's going to be expensive. If you can find 10 people over the years who want to do different pathogens, share facilities, share equipment, share translational know-how, that really helped us, and I think will help everyone. So, coming to the end on this set, some advantages for vaccinology in academia. If you look around, certainly in a big university, there are often people who know an awful lot about the pathogen you might like to vaccinate against, and against that disease. Really worthwhile interacting with them. Often useful pre-existing capacity. Most universities have immunologists. They're not all doing vaccines. They might be helpful. Protein structure, if you have good structural vaccinology capacity, that has been very helpful to us. Micro, epidemiology, and clinical trials. You need a longer term horizon because most the easy vaccines have been made, right? Most vaccines are now hard. And non-repayable financing. So when people give us grants, we don't plan to pay them back. So last slide on this is, I'm afraid, the most depressing slide, because the toughest thing to do in this area is to raise money. And the key thing is to start small, that's what we did, and try and build up some credibility, because frankly, grant review bodies don't find it easy to figure out whether your idea for a better vaccine for a specific disease might work. The way you find out is by funding the grant and seeing if it does. So you've got to be convincing, being at a major center, being around good people, having done it before, all of those things help, and getting started is hard. And generally what you need, I've given the usual suspects down here, national governments, particularly in Africa. African governments should be funding not just manufacturing, which many of them want to do, but R&D at an early stage. EVCTP, fantastic example of international funding, particularly for Africa. Philanthropies, find your favorite billionaire if you can. And other real organizations like Wellcome and Gates, been doing this for decades. Alumni of your institution and others may want their name on your activity. And eventually, and this is at the wrong end, of course, there may be some royalty income from sales of the vaccine, but that will generally take many, many years. So I'm being frank about that. This is not easy. If you can start small, that really is helpful. So I was asked to say a little bit about the Jenner Institute and what we did in this space in the last 5 minutes. So just to give you a feel for this, and remember we have been going now nearly 20 years, so we didn't do all of this overnight. So the first thing we did was we got a good name. Over to you. We liked this name. We saw the guys in Paris having Institut Pasteur and thought Jenner was pretty good too, particularly in the vaccine space, so we called it after Edward Jenner. This is what we tried to do: global health, translational research, and One Health with veterinary partners. And that's often really helpful. If you're going to work on TB, cow is a pretty good model, actually, and people have them. So that was the thinking at the beginning. We were pretty indiscriminate in terms of disease indication. Somebody came along and said, we're really interested in dengue. I'm from Mexico, I'm from Brazil, I want to work on dengue. Fine. We found some facilities near to a hospital. That's good, because when you do your clinical trials, you're probably going to need to be at a clinical center. Over the years, an amazing number of people turned up. I won't go through all of those, partly because there weren't many academic vaccine activities in the UK at the time, and we ended up doing a mishmash of other diseases, of various diseases, arguably all of them very important, but some much easier than others. I think, for example, Zika is probably a very easy vaccine to make, isn't out there and licensed. HIV, I've told you, is very difficult, and therapeutic vaccines, even against slow-growing cancers like prostate, are still very difficult. You've heard about outbreak pathogens. I'm not going to rehearse that except to make the point to say we've managed to out-license some of these. Famously, the COVID vaccine very, very quickly. I think you've heard about that from Tess. To AstraZeneca, who were heroic in terms of taking on a high-risk vaccine. High risk in the sense we'd never made a licensed outbreak pathogen vaccine before. And if you can partner with companies, even if it's with their vaccine, that's useful. You learn. So in Ebola in 2014, yes, GSK were doing chimpanzee adenovirus vectors, our favorite technology. We worked with them to rush a vaccine out to West Africa and to start vaccinating there as quickly as possible. And sometimes you even get a biotech company. Vaccitech was one I was involved in co-founding. They took on MERS, and that is now going forward seriously. They're probably going to manufacture in Saudi Arabia and have vaccines locally ready for what is a Middle Eastern problem. We've done a lot of trials. These are small trials. They're not hugely expensive. Malaria, over 60 trials across many PIs. TB, Helen McShane's program, Tom Hankey and HIV, so on and so forth. And you really learn, sometimes not what you want to learn, that your vaccine really doesn't work, when you do a lot of clinical trials fairly inexpensively. We were huge fans way back in 2000 of challenge studies. We did the first challenge study with malaria in Europe. Sounds odd these days, everyone's doing challenge studies, even I think as many as 20 pathogens people have been infected by safely and ethically, and done here in Kenya, of course, as well for malaria, and that list grows longer. But if you really want to impress an industrial partner, having efficacy data in like 20 people in your challenge model with your first-in-human vaccine is a great way to go, if you can, and if there is a challenge model. And as I said, there are 20 microbes now where you can challenge. Even for TB, you don't challenge with TB, you challenge with aerosolized BCG. So that's a faster way to partnering at scale. As you know, we're spoiled. We have outstanding partners, including many in Kenya. This is just a list of some of the major ones over the years. And this, I suppose, is the most important slide in terms of facilities. We set up the Institute by bringing together 3 programs, malaria, HIV, and TB, with separate PIs. We realized we had a better shot at raising core funding for core facilities by working together, and this is where we are today. The viral vector core facility is the oldest one. We have a team of 5 people who all day, every day, make recombinant viral vectors. Nearly all of them adenoviruses these days. It used to be modified Vaccinia ankara, which has been less useful. But this means that if you're a grad student turning up in the first year and you want to make a vaccine for a new disease, you don't have to spend your first year or 2 learning how to make a recombinant viral vector. You pay these guys $1,000 or whatever, and they will make you a recombinant vector. And as you can see here, they've made over 450 so far. They made the COVID one in weeks, so they're pretty good at it, but you need scale for that. We're working on an mRNA core facility. It's not up and running yet, but it's made a lot of progress, and we've made lots of mRNAs, and we're vaccinating. It's not gone public in a sense just yet. Adjuvant Bank, one of our amazing postdocs, I was going to say begged, stole, or borrowed. She didn't steal. She got hold of a whole load of adjuvants, and we have about 50 now that can be compared. Flow cytometry, lots of immunology, protein production, and you don't need all of these. You need suitable facilities for whatever you're making. And we've become big fans of virus-like particles, as we used to call them, or nanoparticles, as we call them today, many of them on a hepatitis B platform. There's people ask about the mRNA core facility. It's fairly expensive. Lots of people tried to start making mRNA vaccines once they saw the COVID results. mRNA has its place. It's very rapid. It's very immunogenic for antibodies. It's pretty expensive to manufacture. It's not very durable in terms of those antibody responses. They come down very quickly. But the great thing about mRNA is it can be improved, like all new vaccine technologies. I'm excited about different lipid nanoparticles that might solve some of those challenges, and I think it's definitely going to find a place, but it's not a panacea. Sometimes you get lucky. This is a building opposite our clinical center. It was built in about 1998 by a professor of pathology making monoclonal antibodies in there. He retired in 2005, leaving 6 or 7 staff who were suddenly going to be without a job. We got the building free by saying we could fund some GMP manufacturing. Now, that's not going to happen everywhere, but this has been really useful. We've made about 23 different vaccines of different types so far. And remember, vaccine manufacture is usually more expensive than a phase 1 clinical trial. So when you think about raising money, your biggest bill is manufacturing, and even worse, if you go to a contract manufacturer out there, they'll be a bit more expensive, yes, but really worse, they're going to take time because they won't be in business unless they have a list of manufacturers ready to do. So when they come to you and say, yep, $2 million, we can do it for you, here's exactly what we'll do, they don't mean tomorrow or next month. If you're lucky, they mean next year, so that delays you. And one of the questions I keep getting asked is, why could you do stuff so fast in COVID and it's taking you 30 years to do a malaria vaccine? There's a very long answer slide I'll finish up to show you that we've made lots of these. We also work with industrial partners. It's not just a source of income for your program, it's a real source of expertise. And most of the people who've ever worked on vaccines have been in industry, so worth working with them. Where have we ended up? This is the third last slide. COVID, you know, we managed to not just partner with AstraZeneca, but very importantly, they partnered with the Serum Institute of India, who made well over 2 billion doses in 2 years at huge scale and at very low cost. Malaria, I've talked about, R21 now licensed and being rolled out probably from this week. TB, viral vector territory, same for HIV because you need good T cells, and a typhoid vaccine from Andy Pollard's group, partnered again with an Indian company, Bharat. That's been very impactful. So I will just stop with a list of the funders that we've been able to access some support from. Glad to see you have your own list building up here. It's really important, I think, that you get national support and explain to your national government that if they put money in, more money will come. If they put nothing in, nothing will come. So we were very lucky in the UK that we could access UKRI, which is government funding, a huge charity, the Wellcome Trust, another charity in Seattle that happens to support people around the world, not just in the US, and lots of other partners shown on this slide. I'll leave it there and be happy to take questions.
Are there any questions? Okay, then I'll introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Watu Wamae. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oxford Initiative. The Africa Oxford Initiative at the University of Oxford. She holds a PhD in economics on innovation, and she has held postdoctoral positions at the Science and Technology Research Unit, University of Sussex, and UNU Merit at Maastricht. She has a special interest in strategic approaches to innovation networks and how these contribute to acquiring innovation capabilities. At AfOx, she's taken the lead in setting up the Africa Oxford Innovation Platform, which she directs. And it supports early stage ventures in turning science based solutions into viable businesses to address high priority challenges in Africa. So, with that little brief introduction, I'll let her come onto the stage and give her talk.
I need your help. It doesn't allow me to do anything. And I need to go beyond that. Nothing is happening. We're getting there. Right. Thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be back in Nairobi, and I'm very excited to talk to you about some of the thinking that has been happening in terms of the private sector with regards to Africa. Um, but when Marianne asked me to talk about this, the first question I had is, what private sector? What private sector do we mean? Are we thinking in terms of big pharma and Africa? We've just seen on Adrian's presentation that actually there are complications around that. The first question, generally speaking, is the question of return on investment. Is there a big enough market? Are they going to be able to make profit? And so on and so forth. So this usually does not go to plan. Now, how about African companies? Is this an option at all? There's a big question around that because we don't really have a private sector or industry in this space, and not just in this space, but also in pharmaceuticals. What you normally find is fill and finishing. So I just pulled out a few companies here that are part of the Africa Manufacturing Vaccine Initiative, and possibly Afrigen in South Africa might be doing some, engaging in some steps that are around vaccine innovation. But these examples are far and few between. Most of the existing companies, such as the Superstar de Dakar, it's all about fill and finish. Oh, you can't hear at all? Okay. Okay. And my screen has been cut off. There are no titles. Well, I'll just carry on. No, because I've made changes. Why do I press for this?
It's on.
Oh, okay. Is this much better? Yeah, okay. I'll just carry on now. So yeah, so it does sound a little bit as though it's a bit of doom and gloom. It's not very clear where to begin. And actually, with regards to the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative, the clue is in the title. It's about manufacturing. It's not about vaccine development. There are other efforts, ongoing efforts, apart from AVMI. So there's a partnership for Africa vaccine manufacturing. Again, manufacturing is the key here, and this is a framework that helps to create an ecosystem. So in the previous presentation, we had that it's important to have an ecosystem that enables vaccines to be developed, including the government putting funding to one side, regardless of all the competing interests and so on, and there are many other things to think about. Now, you're obviously familiar with COVAX that was created during the pandemic, and as you can see here, it was supposed to help vaccine developers. So this is primarily in contexts where actually vaccine development is happening. And whilst we have these two initiatives, we are still very much on the manufacturing side. Now, so if there's no private sector that is actually doing any of this vaccine development, and hardly any manufacturing to speak of, what might be the other vaccine development approaches that have existed? So in some cases, one might speak of government-owned facilities. Yesterday, Musa gave a bit of insight on this, Musa from ILRI, and the way he summarized it, and I quote him, is that what governments produce vaccines except in communist countries. And even here in Kenya, for the veterinary vaccines, they're usually, connected to public research organizations and universities, and it's not something to basically talk of as a, a model example. Other approaches are needed. There have been other approaches. You may be familiar with product development partnerships. I'm not sure why part of my slides have been cut off. Is it the thing that is true? Oh, okay. Shall I do this then? Move into, whoops. Shall I do it this way?
Yeah, that should work.
Okay, here. Yeah, this is much better, I think. Let's see what happens. Oops. Not really. Okay, let me do it. You don't want to use presenter mode. Okay, let me just carry on. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So we've done the best we could, so we'll just have to carry on this way. But I still need the full view, because if I do that, let me see. Oh dear. For me to be able to press on the next slide thing, I'll need to come to this space. A little bit. Yeah, we're almost there. If it doesn't work, I'll just take you. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks. All right. Apologies for that. I hope we won't have any more hiccups. So I was saying that, so Musa talked about governments manufacturing vaccine, and although that could help in some shape or form, it's not exactly the route to go to, or not to consider other options. Now, other options that have existed over the last 20 years are product development partnerships. And what these really are, they're models to help develop vaccines that are neglected or that the private sector or big pharma wouldn't take on board. And it's usually for, maybe neglected tropical diseases and so on and so forth. And these cover not just vaccines, but therapeutics, diagnostics, etc. And they're obviously not for profit making, and the funding is mostly philanthropic. And they try to actually do the development part. And there are examples for, animals. We have government that is headquartered in Edinburgh. There are others that you know about, such as IAVI, and in the drug space, DNDi. Now, this model is primarily geared to making available the products. So what you do find is that usually for the product development, they will bring on board capabilities that exist in Western Europe or North America. So there is the question of developing local capabilities that is left hanging. Of course, it's very important to get the vaccines and vaccinate people and so on and so forth. But a more sustainable approach, though not necessarily a more straightforward one, is to actually create the capabilities as well. And you'll see how that happens. So a number of years ago, about 10 years ago, I was having a look at the different activities. So this is a little bit dated, but it just gives you a sense of the sorts of things they do beyond vaccines and drugs. There's diagnostics. But the focus again here, at the time, this picture might have changed, was on these big diseases. We have a vaccine for malaria now, but that a lot of funding was going in that direction. HIV is still a lot of effort going in there. Some level of other diseases also happen, but these diseases may not be global diseases. For example, Lassa fever maybe is endemic primarily in West Africa, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't need to be tackled because it doesn't have a massive return on investment. So that those activities need to happen anyway, and they're likely to come from there being capabilities within African countries, even if one might, think about interesting ways to leverage on collaborations, and I'll say more about that shortly. So it's not all doom and gloom. You know, I've gone on and on, said there's no private sector. The other possibilities that exist, government, product development partnerships, are not really covering everything. We need to think a little bit harder. It's definitely not. I mean, I'm a very optimistic person, so I don't think it's it's all doom and gloom. Although I'm going to begin on a somber note, you're familiar with this diagram. Again, Musa talked about it yesterday. He was talking about the valley of death. And there, where we have a trough, you know, is where lots of things disappear, lots of good work that's happening, your publications, you know, your prototype. And this is very difficult. This is no consolation, but this is not characteristic to African countries only. It's across the world. But then again, difficult as it is, companies or countries do find pathways out of that. And again, this is where sometimes the government, you know, becomes a very important contributor to processes by helping to develop, you know, an ecosystem that makes it possible to go beyond this valley of death. Now, in the case of Africa, you know, I'm going to be very, you know, frank. It's about starting from scratch. There's no private sector to talk about. And even if one might say, well, maybe you could start with the manufacturing, you know, fill and finish, all that, you know, packaging, and then somehow miraculously, organically, you know, capabilities will be built at that level and then they'll morph upstream. It doesn't quite happen like that. There has to be deliberate efforts put in place to help develop vaccines. And one of the key ingredients to deal with the valley of death is developing specialized capabilities. So these are capabilities that are not very different from the ones we saw in the previous presentation that are involved in translational research. In fact, part of them are shared within academia and within industry, and there's a lot of interaction because it creates a possibility of being able to share knowledge because you can imagine, for example, at the manufacturing facility that we saw on the screen, it's a small unit, obviously. So you have, I'll take the analogy of baking a cake. Let's assume I can bake this fantastic cake and everybody is in agreement in my kitchen oven and, you know, it's the best cake, and somebody says to me, why don't you produce it in batches and sell all over the world and make billions of dollars? Well, it's not a straightforward process of taking the same recipe and replicating it. There has to be adjustments that are made to this recipe so that when the product comes out of the production system, it has the same exact taste, the same exact specifications, and so on. And this happens thanks to these highly specialized capabilities that straddle academia and industry. And I'll say more about that. They are complex because the way to build them, there's a long learning process, and the way to build them is basically to be able to have companies and do the learning whilst developing them. So it sounds a little bit like a catch-22. So if we don't have a private sector, how are you then going to develop these capabilities? I'll hold on to that and leave you to think a little bit about it and how we could get out of that conundrum. What I will say is that it always seems impossible until it is done. And you can imagine even in, you know, Western Europe, North America, and other places in the world, it's not as though somehow one day these countries woke up and they had the capabilities. They had to start somewhere. They had to start small and then grow from there. And, you know, one might say, well, you know, we don't have funding. They didn't necessarily have funding. They found ways to get to that point. And I don't think that it's the people in Africa are any different in terms of, you know, the genius level of coming up with solutions, and even in situations where there's a huge amount of scarcity. So it's really thinking laterally. It doesn't have to be a question of taking the existing models elsewhere. We have many examples, not necessarily in vaccine, but, you know, take the example that you probably all are familiar with, the M-Pesa, you know, which came about, say, over 20 years ago. And at the time, nobody was using their phone to send money or pay their bills or anything of the sort anywhere else in the world. In the more developed places, there were ATMs everywhere. There still are. There's a whole, system that supports the banking system, and that was not a big challenge for money to move around. And I recall, because I was actually very much involved in some of those discussions, that there was a very big challenge because sending money on the phone means that this is happening within the telecoms sector. And there was a big push by the banking sector that if the telecom sector is going to be allowed to do that, they have to face the same exact conditions that the banking sector faces. Thankfully, the government can sometimes do things that have not been done, or at least help them to happen. So what did happen was that the central bank said, well, this doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. It doesn't, there are rules that have governed the banking sector, but we can change that. We'll just create a new law, and telecoms will be able to do that because they could see the benefit for the unbanked population and how that would help create a dynamic economy. So it's not a question of saying, well, we don't have the same resources, as other parts of the world. It's also using our genius to think how we can work around that. And I'm sure there are many people in this room who are going to sort out that problem. Now, I'll just take a step back and talk about science and science PhDs. I have some information here from the UK because it's available, and I couldn't find anything for representing an African country. But anyhow, this is sufficient to make the point. So this is a 2010 study by the Royal Society. It's still fairly relevant. I don't think it's completely outdated, but we can see that 53% of graduates go outside science careers. That's okay. We need social workers, teachers, artists, and so on and so forth. Then 47 of them who are in science, only 30% continue into early career research. So this is the people who might eventually end up in what Adrian was describing, when you start small and you start, doing some work at the university level. So 30% go in that direction. And of these 30%, somewhere along the way, about 26% of those, there's a level of attrition, and it's a massive attrition, will come out of academia and go to other, careers that are outside science. And then those ones who will stay, until, they retire, a small percentage, less than 5%. And Adrian is obviously part of that, less than 0.5% in the UK. These are UK statistics. The interesting point here is the 17% that goes to industry. So this is non-university research industry. And this is critical because industry does do some research, because that is what allows it to be possible to turn that recipe for baking a cake at home to become a recipe that can be used for industrial production and many, many other things, which I'm going to talk about very shortly. Now, I don't want to belabor the point with this valley of death. The reason why I've brought up this slide again is simply to emphasize that my scope is really to talk about the very middle part. So I'm going to try and focus on that. It's not to say that upstream doesn't matter, but in any case, we know it does, and Adrian has said quite a bit about that. And then downstream, where we have the market, is also equally important, but that is a talk for another time. Maybe Marianne is going to invite me again and I can thrash that out with you. But and it's very important to think about these downstream elements. As you can see, they matter, including things like marketing and so on, and regulation and so on, and how do you come up with financial models that make sense? Does it mean you might need a modular approach, or flexible facilities? What could that look like, and so on and so forth? Very big, important questions, but not for today's discussion. So I'll just carry on back to that middle part. And this diagram here resonates with the valley of death. So what tends to happen if you want to be able to really engage in vaccine development you need the upstream skills that help to create either new knowledge and transform it, so basic research, translational research, and create specifications that could be applied. And then on the other side, we have non-R&D specific capabilities. This is not to say it doesn't include a level of R&D expertise, but anyhow, within the African context, what you find, it's mostly about production and marketing. So packaging and so on and so forth, and then marketing. So what is glaring here is that there's a missing bubble right bang in the middle. And that missing bubble are those skills that I'm calling skills for the development and production of products and processes. And usually they rely heavily on applied sciences for obvious reasons, because we saw the sort of expertise that is required, immunology, all that stuff, and so on and so forth. And also, a certain level of bioengineering, etc. Those skills don't exist or are very limited within the African context. And it is not to say there isn't talent or potential that could help to create a critical mass around that. And the importance of those skills, as you can see, is they create a seamless pathway from translational research. There's an overlap, so you have within industry a group of people who are able to engage. They also write publications, and quite often they move seamlessly between academia and industry. They might have a stint in industry, come back to academia, and so on and so forth. And then it might also be a case if it's within academia and you have spin-offs, they may be involved to an extent, if they come up with very interesting science, involved in companies that then go off, are set up and go off and deal with the following stages. So those skills are very important. They're not impossible to create, but they cannot be ignored. And they don't quite exist within Africa, but we know we do have a lot of talent, so there's possibilities to think much harder about how to do that. Now, just very quickly, so these are, I'm calling them design and engineering capabilities. So these are capabilities that are able to modify specifications, adapt them. They are able to reconfigure, knowledge, use it differently, and so on and so forth. When you have new technologies, integrate that, move on to the next thing. But you have to be within that space working, otherwise you de-skill. The capabilities become disarticulated if you do not have an environment, an industry where you could carry on, building on them and exercising on them. So that's what is actually the missing piece and what we need to be thinking more about. If within Africa we are going to be able to talk about vaccine development. These design and engineering capabilities, it's not, when we say design, or in my mind when I say design, I'm not thinking simply about the aesthetics, obviously. So there's the element of specifications of products and processes and capabilities able to do that. And then on the engineering side, these are skills that extend towards the realization of those specifications and the operation of of operational forms to allow the production systems to be set up and so on and so forth. So very important skills there to actually grapple with. Now, where does this leave us, you might be asking? So nurturing an innovation ecosystem is not an option. It needs to happen. Again, a fairly big role for government, but not just government, because talent remains the main thing, and being able to develop that talent. Funding tends to follow talent. So if you start small with small funding, you're able to attract more funding and to carry on building that. Yesterday, Musa was, also mentioning that it's very, very difficult to find good vaccine developers within Africa. And when you find them, or at least find potential that can be trained up fairly quickly, there's also very high turnover. People leave. And the reason for this are multiple. But the key point is that it's very important to find ways to align incentives to be able to build that critical mass. In addition to building that capability or that capacity, there are many other complexities that within the African continent or African countries one has to be thinking about. So I'm not going to rehearse this. The first bullet point there, Adrian talked about it at length. And then also the disciplinary sort of, understanding immunology, structural biology, all that has to be developed. It's developed with a lag. It's developed whilst you're doing. It's not something that, sort of happens by reading a book. There's a practical element to it. And then once you're able to do that within a university setup and create your prototype, and you want to move on beyond that, you have to think about the additional components, which might not be readily available. You might have to make them yourself. You might not be able, to sort of import them because maybe you don't have the supply chains that allow that to happen. Or if you can create, those supply chains can be created. It might be a question again of maybe collaborating with the government or other, collaborators to think about how to make that happen. And of course, there's the question of utilities. For many of these facilities, you don't want a situation where you have constant power outages, for example. And then even beyond that, you have to be thinking about the administration of it. It also needs some sort of expertise and understanding how to get to that point. So we can see that there's a lot to think about in terms of the capabilities that would successfully enable African countries to actually develop vaccines. The good news, though, is that if you look at the demographics, the dynamics of the population, there are a lot of young, economically, productive people, and this is going to carry on for a few, at least possibly till the end of this century. And there's much more sort of, people being trained up. They're able to do much more research within universities generally. In the past, they were mostly teaching universities. Some of them have been able to move ahead and, move into the research side of things, the upstream side of things. And we also know globally that collaborative research is very important. It has happened over a very long time within universities. We are talking centuries here. Even before there was the internet, collaborations were happening where the people had to send their manuscript by ship to people who are working in the same area, etc. All that was happening because it helps to sort of share knowledge and build on it and so on and so forth. And then, of course, within in countries, highly industrialized countries, there's also an industry, and within this industry, there are research networks at different levels with different types of companies, etc. Maybe some of them supplying those additional components that are required, and engaging about how to produce the correct specifications and so on. So the discussion that Marianne asked me is really centered in the overlap between those two, but you can see why that would be a little bit tricky to talk about within the African context. Again, I spell doom, and I have some seeds of hope. It may well be possible that we can borrow from how research has begun to gain momentum. So it's not just research within universities, but over the last decade or so, we've seen a mushrooming of research networks. And these are big networks, looking at specific research, let's say TB. So at KwaZulu-Natal, there's Tumbi Dungu who does, work like that. And there are many other Deltas programs that you might be familiar with, where they bring the expertise regardless of which university it's based in, and create these sort of virtual networks where they're able to share facilities, do more research on the disease area they're working on, train up more people, more postgraduates, and so on and so forth. And this has proved to be very successful. There's currently, so Deltas is funded by the Wellcome Trust, as you probably know. There's also Pandemic Sciences Africa, and this one is funded by the MasterCard, and they are both in collaboration with the Science Foundation for Africa, that's based here in Nairobi. And there's potentially a possibility to borrow some insights from that and think about innovation-led research networks that could help to begin to create this private sector or this industry that is missing. It's no mean task, but it's possible to think about how that could happen. So obviously the key ingredient here is the D&E capabilities that I mentioned, but I would like to say a little bit about why innovate. Exactly. Just take a step back. Why innovate? So what you will find is that even in those countries where they have big pharma continuously innovates. And the reason for that is because if you, for example, are a fast mover with a certain technology and you're making many gains, your company is growing, etc., technology tends to happen in waves. Something else that is better, that is quicker, and this is the case with the mRNA vaccine that wasn't previously there. The Jenner Institute is trying to build a facility and also build that capability. So you have to be thinking about the next technology that would help you to actually stay abreast of what is going on. And this within big pharma tends to happen within the company. There's usually a bit of tension anyhow, because the real money is coming from what you're able to exploit, the technology you've already sort of established. The new one, things are failing, projects are starting, they're very expensive, they don't go anywhere, and so on and so forth. So there is a tension, but then it's very well understood that, technology follows sigmoid curves, and you have to be able to have something to latch onto before the dominant technology peters off and you're left standing. So we've seen a lot of industries that just shut down because they've been overtaken by events and so on. So the way to keep in there is to do it. So they do this. And why am I talking to you about this? Because, I've already said we don't have this, such companies in the African context. Well, within big pharma, even if they may do them in-house, currently they do R&D work very differently to the past. In the past, they had big research and development units. They ended up shutting them down and creating smaller, more nimble and flexible approaches to that. This includes actually buying off startups, for example. So somebody else is doing the heavy lifting, etc., and then you demonstrate to them, and then you sell it off to them because they have the capabilities to move to the next level. And of course, you walk away with a massive paycheck, and you can go off and set another company and carry on that way. But at the end of the day, those capabilities or that expertise to be able to set up this company has to be developed somehow. And one of the ways, or rather the main way that it is developed, is by doing that stuff. They're smaller companies, but then very high expertise or exceptional expertise is required. Now, bringing this down to Africa, how would that happen with these startups that I'm talking about? So we know spin-offs haven't quite taken off, so I'm going to focus on startups. But where do you go? Because you probably need a wet lab. I mean, how are you actually going to do this? So this is the question I want to leave you with. One of the pathways is obviously to think about innovation and entrepreneurship. It doesn't have to be the Silicon Valley model. Nothing stops us from thinking about a model that makes more sense for the African context, maybe along the lines of impact investment and how that could work. We don't have to get caught up with, all these funding rounds that then, within no time, a startup has been valued at billions of dollars and it's not, producing anything at all. But then, some of it, a lot of it is a lot of hype. A lot of these companies die. But there's big money out there that is able to maybe cushion that. And that money is not necessarily available to Africa, hence why that it may also be a case of thinking about a model. So the Silicon Valley model, for those who don't know, has not always been there. It emerged out of the Second World War. So countries were rebuilding. The US had to think about new ways because all their capabilities had been turned to developing, products for the war. And now it was time to rebuild the economy. They had to think hard about how to create that energy. And this is how startups came to be. And they work in some sectors relatively well, mostly digital technologies, fintech, etc. Not necessarily very well in biotechnology or life sciences, but definitely better, in the US. And we all know that in Africa, even if we say there's a lot of innovation that's going on, it's all about marketplace solutions, fintech, e-commerce, etc. You can get your laptop, come up with an algorithm, sell it to Safaricom, and so on and so forth. Even if you had trained as a bioengineer or biostatistics, you still need, an income at the end of the month, and you might decide, well, let me go and get myself a plum job at Safaricom or somewhere else. So there are lots of problems that come along with there not being a career pathway to develop those skills. So it's really about thinking about how to do that. Now, I'm going to stop there because I think I've spoken for fairly long, but it would be remiss of me not to say anything about the Africa Oxford Initiative. So I'll follow Adrian's cue there and say very quickly just one or two things. So we work with the University of Oxford to make Africa a strategic priority. So the people we work with exclusively are Africans based in Africa. So we have a number of programs. So there's an education program mostly supporting students at the master's level from Africa. There's also a research component, primarily working with visiting fellows, so usually postdocs and beyond. And then there's innovation, and within innovation, working with African-based innovators, so they have a robust science background, they're able to configure and reconfigure and think differently, etc. They're coming usually from science fields, mostly medical fields, engineering, and so on and so forth. And they may have the disciplinary element sorted out. They understand the science and how to reconfigure it. But to create a startup or a venture, you need to understand the business side. So that is one thing we help with. But then even if you have the robust science, you might need to collaborate. Collaboration is very important. So there's the possibility of collaborating with Oxford and thinking about the solution that you're developing. And then the ultimate goal is then to think about innovation leadership, helping to create an ecosystem around that. And then finally, we have an angle with systems, because this is about changing mindsets. So systems change, and its importance is obvious. So we've been running this program on the innovation platform that I lead since 2001. We've had 3 cohorts so far. They all come from different countries across Africa. There are no limits, 54 African countries or 55, depending on how you want to think about that. So they come from all different countries. We had Cornelius, who's from Uganda, who was working on a vaccine. He's the only one we've had so far. So hopefully we'll have many more from you in times to come. And then in terms of coverage, I said we work across Africa. So far, we've been able to work with 18 countries and over 80 African-based innovators. And you might be interested to know currently our call for Innovation Fellows is out. So this is for cohort 4. You're welcome to apply. You have the QR there if you want to take that on with your phone and apply if this is something that could be of interest to you. And then finally, we have a team. So this is my team. Just this week, we were awarded the Vice Chancellor's Award for the work we are doing. We're a small team, even if we have quite a bit of work in different programs. So I thought I'll leave you with that. And in case someone is thinking that the VC is the tall man with gray hair, you're wrong. Our VC is a woman, so I'll leave you to guess who that might be. So thank you very much for your time.
So thank you, Dr. Wamae. Any questions for her before she leaves the stage? Okay, so I'll introduce. I can't see.
Thank you. I think this is an afterthought. So my question concerns both Prof. Adrian Hill and Madam. So the insightful presentation was talking about translation of research into products. So my question is, what is the best approach if you are in academia? Do you stop at product development and concept development, or you go all the way? I'm thinking in the African concept where we don't have funds. You might have an interesting idea, And because the big pharma or someone else might leapfrog you into manufacturing, how do you handle that? Patenting is not the best way to make money. You might have a patent, then it stalls. So that's the first question. Yeah, the second one is on Madam, where you were talking about the skills in biomanufacturing, biopharma. So you see that most of the educational curriculum for Africa was kind of laid back. We didn't have that bridge. And when you see the most recent calls, they will call for someone with, just like saying we want a recent graduate with 3 years or 4 years experience. It's impossible. You can't have the bioinformatics skills or engineering skills to bring into, if you're an upstream scientist, process development, you cannot scale up quickly. You need to get other aspects of that course. So how, in your view, how do you quickly bridge that gap to have that critical mass that you're talking about around the area of bioengineering and biomanufacturing? Thank you.
And I'll just go back to where I said, even those countries that are able to fund this, it's not to say that when they began doing this, whether it's 100 years ago, they were awash with funding. So it's thinking creatively. Actually, necessity is the mother. Is the mother of innovation. So even with little funding, one can start somewhere. One can start small. I don't have a solid response. I know it's a big problem, but it's not to say that one should give up and not try and think of ways to not necessarily circumvent, but come up with different ways of thinking about how that might happen, whether it's through collaborations or, it's up to you to figure that out. I'm sure you'd have lots of ideas around that. And then the second question about the curriculum is also a big question. So one might wonder, why do we have this innovation platform? It's an Oxford thing, really. Well, it isn't. It's about Africans and providing an opportunity. I wouldn't say exactly to bridge, but being able to engage from the technical perspective with groups of researchers within Oxford is one way to help yourself skill up. I know Marianne in the beginning, she was talking about the program and it having apprenticeships that send people to facilities or different places, etc. That's the sort of general idea, and the hope is that being involved with, let's say, Oxford researchers working on similar questions is not a one-off thing, a hit and run event. It's, you begin to work together, you build trust, you build a collaboration, you raise funding together, you think about how to do things together and work together. It doesn't have to be with Oxford, it could be with other universities, but that's our small sort of contribution to the process.
Adrian, do you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on one point that I didn't agree with. Look, if you make an invention, say in the vaccine space, 90% of the time, you're going to have worked in a very early stage, probably mouse model of something. So let's say you're improving mRNA vaccine technology, you discover a new lipid that's much better than any of Pfizer's or Moderna's or anyone else's lipids that make great lipid nanoparticles that give you a stronger immune response in mice, right? It's all about immunogenicity at this stage. You need to patent that lipid. There's no other way. We can't change the world's system about intellectual property. You need some way of getting hold of, this is the good news, maybe $1,000. It's not $10,000. And you need somebody, ideally in your institution, who is in the intellectual property office, who will look at that invention and think, is there money to be made out of it? And the answer, of course, is yes. You might sell it to Moderna and make huge amounts of money. But if you decide you're going to go this alone and you need to publish to get anyone interested in your finding, you need to have patented first. No way you can change that. So do you have an intellectual property office? Do you have somebody who can judge whether your invention is potentially valuable? If not, there needs to be a network of innovators who will help you do that
filing. But Africa has to have more patents filed. I don't know what the numbers are, you probably do, but they need to increase. And innovation is not made in clinical trials. Once you're in the clinic, it's all over in terms of what you're doing. You're just finding out how well it works. The discovery is made very early on, and you need to be in a position to own that discovery. And then people will come to you and want to share it and buy it and invest in it. That's how the pathway works.
There was one more question.
As you go for that question, I'll
Okay.
just add on to something. I forgot there was actually 3 questions and not 2. So thank you, Adrian, for picking up on that. And just a small sort of addition, my 5 cents to that is maybe someone is sitting here thinking, oh well, in my country there isn't even a patent office, and my university doesn't even have the skills or the ability to do that. I mean, what can I do? And it's complicated. Patenting is an expensive process. But again, this is a challenge to you to think of maybe alternative ways. Maybe you might be the one supporting your government and advising them how to build the structures that are needed. But it might also be, there might be other solutions to think about. But patenting is definitely very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talks. My name is Christian. My question is in regards to what Prof has been talking about. In my little experience, I've realized that in Africa, most scientists want to carry the product from research and development to shelf, which I think it is really very hard. And maybe I want to run from the case maybe from the UK. How do researchers maybe do such kind of work? When you go in the lab and develop something, how do you end up ready to go to other entities till it is on shelf? Because I'm really very sure that the person who invent or who does something in the lab during the research and development still follows it up until we get the vaccine jabbed. Because my other question also is...
I was hoping you'd ask one question. I was going to say thank you very much for asking a single question. I'm desperate for women to have a chance to ask questions as well. So maybe I'm not the one who's facilitating. If it's a very short question, you can ask it. But if it's a long commentary, maybe we'll move on to
it's very
else.
short.
Okay.
From the talks I've been hearing here and there, we have realized that vaccine production is a system which needs so many people from different backgrounds. And I also want to learn from how the UK does it. How do you bring all these people together, the scientists, economists, all those people, so that they work together to have this vaccine produced? Because here, that kind of work is mainly left for scientists. Thank you.
Thank you. So when Adrian did his presentation, nobody had questions. Now you're asking questions that can be best answered by Adrian. So I'll hand him the mic.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Vaccines is a very multidisciplinary area. You can't do all of them yourself. Nobody individually has that expertise. You need to bring people together. And to be frank, that's much easier in very large research universities than it is in an isolated vaccine institute. And 70 years ago, every country in Europe had a vaccine institute to make their own vaccines. They all went out of business because big pharma came in at grand scale with much bigger manufacturing capacity, and they couldn't compete on price because of the scale of big pharma. That's why the UK has no vaccine manufacturing center. Neither does France anymore. Sanofi Pasteur take over. So scale really matters. But there are a lot of people in Africa. There are a lot of academics. There are a lot of researchers in this room. You need to come together, joining up the different skills that different people have. I'm not suggesting you all go and learn how to do an ELISpot assay. Other people can do those, but you need to link up people who can design immunogens with those who can measure immune responses, who like doing animal studies, later on with biomanufacturing, and others who like doing clinical trials. It's a big activity and it's collaborative. But if those infrastructures don't exist, then it's not easy to set them up yourself. And you don't need 54 such institutes in Africa. You need 3 or 4 good ones that are internationally competitive, and they may be multinational. and they may need initially to be partnered with other countries. That's fine, I think, because you have some advantages being on the ground in the place where many diseases actually needing vaccines are. So you've got to start from somewhere. I think knowing the pieces that you need in the puzzle at the end of the day is crucial, otherwise you'll miss a key piece. But some institution has to take that on and say, we know we need this, we're missing that, how are we going to fit in that? And an intellectual property office is part of the puzzle. And there are plenty of people happy to advise on that. And they're not all in the private sector, some are in the public sector as well.
Okay, so let me move the program along and introduce our next speaker. So our next speaker is Dr. Chiluba Mwila, who's a registered pharmacist and technical advisor on talent development. He's had more than 15 years of experience in training, and he's leading on this initiative to support building capacity in Africa in terms of talent to support localizing vaccine manufacturing. So let me call Dr. Chiluba to the stage.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I was actually hoping that I'm not the next speaker. I was not warned, but it's good that there have been two excellent talks already, which is my favorite because it makes my work easy like that. The day before yesterday, we looked at the state of play for manufacturing on the continent. And I always show this figure because it's a reminder of just how much work needs to be done on the continent for us to get to the agenda that we've set ourselves of making sure that at least 60% of vaccines on the continent are manufactured locally. The other slide also refers to what is expected as demand for the vaccines along the way, where we were in 2040 and 2020 and where we are expected to be in 2040. But these talks today are focused largely on vaccine development, R&D, and on the part of Africa CDC, we've been following a number of steps. Number one question we needed to answer was, what exactly do we need as a continent? We had seen in the past that in most cases, research would follow what the funder is saying. So if a funding institution comes to the continent, they will come with their agenda. And our researchers will have to bend towards that and make sure that they fall in line with that. So the first thing was to have a look at the priority pathogens for vaccine development for the continent. So this has been done, but again, we keep on emphasizing that these priority 22 pathogens that we have been advising researchers to focus on, this is subject to change. So depending on circumstances, some other pathogens might get into this list of priorities. So there are 22 pathogens that have been listed. We see those that have got red boxes are where we do not have the vaccine yet, and those with black boxes, those we do have vaccines that are existing. So we categorized the vaccines into legacy vaccines, which are already existing, and these are required in large volumes and have been in use for a while, but makes a lot of economic sense for vaccine manufacturers to focus on the continent. And then we have the expanding ones. They are existing, but we need more forms of vaccines to be available. And then those that need to be used in outbreaks. For the technology focus, we have not restricted ourselves to what technology platform we need to use. So we put a range all the way from the traditional platforms up to the innovative platforms. I think there's quite a lot of conversations now that we have a lot of proponents for mRNA, and we are also seeing a lot of arguments coming up that we should be careful the way we are selling the technology as if it's a silver bullet. So, but these are interesting conversations, especially if you are in academia and research. The potential value chain focus for the continent has ranged from fill and finish, and I'll get back to this again, drug substance and R&D or preclinical studies. So for the projects, we have different project types, and I think I put up this slide just to also indicate to the participants of this training that it's probably at this point, as you think through your career, to see where exactly you might be interested in focusing. So if you can have a project that focuses on developing a new vaccine or improving an existing vaccine, creating a combination of existing vaccines, or simply improving the processes for the existing vaccines. And then you have different R&D value chain coverage highlighted. And we also give illustration of where these activities are likely to be located. I don't think this is very clear, but this one is a bit more clear. So for those that we have highlighted, the legacy vaccines, and then prioritization for manufacturing in 2040, you have those that are already existing. So we ask our questions: if it exists, what do we need to do? If it doesn't, what do we need to do? So we see, I think, most of we have the legacy vaccines in existence, and maybe the strategy would be to have a look at creating new combinations that can cover more than one or two disease pathogens. And then for expanding, I think we've heard already, we have malaria, but we need to have a look at more, what else can we get, probably with a better efficacy. Now, everyone has talked about, who's been on the stage so far, has talked about the funding. So if you look at the framework for action, Africa CDC tried to put a budget to all the activities that are being implemented towards the 2040 agenda of manufacturing 60% of vaccines. So all the board programs that I had showed on Tuesday, each of those have got estimated budget that's been put there. And of all these, I think I wanted to draw your attention to the R&D. So we see that I think the total budget for the PAVM framework for action is approximately 30 billion. And if you look at the R&D, it takes up 2/3 of that budget. So I think from that estimate, it's sending a signal of what the continent, how much importance the continent places on vaccine R&D. Of course, the way the framework for action has been designed is that the mobilization of the resources for these activities has to come from different sources. So there is sources from the member states, a call for member states to implement allocating at least 1% of their GDP towards research and development, and some of that funding can be channeled to vaccine R&D. This hasn't been implemented, and I think Africa CDC that's one area of focus to mobilize the member states to begin to take this seriously. And then the other sources of funding that my earlier speakers had referred to, research grants, philanthropies, and so on. So this is what has been happening. But again, a big challenge, one of the challenges highlighted again for R&D is the funding itself. So we see that local research centers are, in most cases, unable to access funds, not able to compete with researchers in developed institutions. And there are many reasons. It's got very little or nothing to do with the capacity of African researchers to conduct these researches. But I think one of the things which you can have a look at is the already existing infrastructure in developed countries. Even the funders also have to have a look at that, so it's easier to achieve results in an environment that's already ready to go straight into doing the work, as opposed to starting all the way from the facilities, the equipment, and so on. So that leads me to the other challenge that we have, the lack of sufficient and appropriate R&D infrastructure. So this is a very big issue on the continent. The other one is lack of existing networks and expertise. I think this has been looked at extensively by the previous speaker. Expertise, I think we get to see, again, I'll echo the influence of brain drain. we get to have brilliant scientists on the continent, but most of them eventually end up leaving. On the part of networking, I think there are some examples already which were highlighted, and again talk about what the strategies for Africa CDC in terms of creating these networks. And again, there was an example earlier highlighted on the need of GMP manufacturing facility for clinical trials. We see that when it comes to this, we're still relying on manufacturing facilities of the continent to provide the materials required for clinical trials. So certain strategic interventions have to be put in place. Something that's been discussed include the setting up of regional R&D centers, developing or establishing R&D coordinating platform across the continent, and then also consideration for having a GMP manufacturing facility to support the clinical trials on the continent. So quite similar to what I had talked about on Tuesday, establishing the network of R&D centers. Of course, for Africa CDC, regional representation is quite important. But what we also envision is that once these R&D centers, by the way, although the name might seem like it's a single institution, if you zoom in it, you see that we are bringing together different players within the R&D space to create that network. Okay, so what we then see is that these R&D centers will likely get to a point where there's specialization. So you can have one R&D center that is specialized on clinical trials, for example. Others will specialize in preclinical studies. And maybe the specialization can follow different platforms of vaccine development. And at the bottom there, you see the regional capability and capacity networks that I talked about, that is responsible for workforce development to support the R&D centers. So I had mentioned that this network will be responsible for developing workforce for biomanufacturing and workforce for vaccine R&D. And so we see that we started providing some interventions regarding to that. I had mentioned the biomanufacturing competence framework that defines the skills and competencies that you need to have within for biomanufacturing. And within that, you've got a structure of different positions that have been proposed. A similar framework has also been developed and published for R&D, vaccine R&D, which is also intended to support the R&D, vaccine R&D on the continent. So this R&D coordinating platform being established to guide continental R&D vaccine priorities and strategy, support information sharing and collaboration across regions and countries, developing partnerships with local and international organizations. So we see there are some which are already in existence, but we see that these will be the primary hosts of these R&D centers, and then we can bring on board other stakeholders and collaborations from outside the continent. And then bring together scientists and experts across the continent to share progress and learning regularly. And then promoting scale-up of infrastructure and networks. So once we have these R&D centers, and then becomes a little bit more organized to direct the resources towards these R&D centers. including animal study facilities and contract research organization. Thank you. And I can imagine there are no questions.
So I'd like to now invite all the speakers from this session for a panel discussion. Okay, so I'll start with you, Professor Hill. My first question is, the Jenner Institute has been successful in translating research into tangible vaccine solutions. What lessons can African academic institutions learn from the Jenner approach to achieve similar success?
Thanks. I guess one of the overriding lessons is that you can do this stuff in a university if you have the right partnerships. And we were fairly early into this game of trying to make vaccines within a university. We focused on a few diseases to start with, HIV, TB, and malaria, ones we knew would be funded for a while because they weren't going to be easy, and tried to build up capacity over time. It was not a bad time to be starting in the early 2000s. There was increasing interest in global health. There was increasing interest in vaccines. Foundations like the Gates Foundation that didn't exist beforehand were funding internationally. And today is very much the same, oddly due to a global pandemic. So there's lots of interest in vaccines that wasn't there in 2019. I think one of the major lessons is to appreciate that all of this takes time. It definitely takes money, but it doesn't take billions, it takes millions. And you need to try and find a sort of central funding agency regionally or nationally that will encourage this and provide some core support. So we had core funding from the Wellcome Trust for the first 5 or 10 years. That's gone away now. Wellcome have changed their priorities a bit, and we're able to keep going. But you know, we have lots and lots of problems that we still need to solve. What we have been able to do is to attract lots of really good young people who are now PIs and are keeping the whole thing going. So I think the main lesson is to get started. You had a great summary just now of what needs to be done, but you know, don't expect it all to happen overnight. It's going to take years. All right, there are different questions. IPR issues I touched on early. We have a intellectual property office in the university, Oxford University Innovation, that assesses so-called inventions that we bring to them. They pay the bills for filing the patent, and if the patent makes money, they take a small cut of that. I think that's fairly standard in many universities. Sorry, the next question was? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, most of the trials that we have done, and in malaria we've done about 100, and we number them, VAC 001 to 99, we're just about to start 100, are small phase 1A or phase 1B clinical trials, some phase 2. We've done one phase 3 out of those 100. Hopefully some more will be coming in malaria alone. The answer is that We use both our in-house manufacturing facility, and for new vaccine types, we try and find contract manufacturers who have done that type of manufacturing before. I would just emphasize that probably the least important of the things I've heard on the long list of things you'd like to have improved in Africa is contract manufacturing. As long as you're outsourced manufacturer for small scale production is able to do it, it doesn't really matter whether they're in Korea or in Paris or in Dakar or wherever, as long as they can produce the batch at a sensible price. And some of them are quite expensive. But that's not know-how you need for the ultimate market provision. So you need at least two types of manufacturers, those who will get you a small batch, hopefully inexpensively, into the clinic. If you have your own facility, even better. But there are lots of CROs or CMOs, as they're called, contract manufacturing organizations out there that you might want to get to know for the technology that you're prioritizing, whether it's nanoparticles or viral vectors or whatever. You don't have to have that down the road. You do have to have immunology in-house. You definitely need an animal facility. You need people who can do clinical trials, ideally near you. Ours is about 200 meters away. But you've got to start somewhere, and you can't start with all of those in the one place at the same time.
Thank you very much. So I'll move to you, Dr. Wamae. Your presentation suggested that Africa is facing a vicious cycle of limited career pathways and innovative R&D, and the shortage of vaccine development expertise. This, combined with incentives in North America and Western Europe for African talent, compounds the situation. How do we move from this vicious cycle to a more virtuous cycle?
Yeah, so there is a hidden question in there that's about immigration that maybe I need to tackle head on. So obviously there are incentives that are aligned in industrialized countries, also looking for talent. It's no secret. And in fact, the high turnover that I was talking about, it's difficult to find people who can develop vaccines. When you develop the potential, the turnover is very high. Presumably, some of these people go to non-science, jobs, big sort of companies, and maybe even doing marketing for products that have nothing to do with health. They could be selling shoes for Unilever. But then, of course, there is a good proportion that are determined to stay within that career, but because of the struggle of finding career paths locally, they may go to Australia, to Western Europe, to North America, and there are clear incentives to attract this talent. Now, I do not despair that there's a leaky pipeline in the sense that people are getting onto a flight and going to, let's say, the UK, because I see this more as an opportunity, actually, for them to stay within the pathway because it doesn't exist here, to carry on, not to get de-skilled, A, and B, what tends to happen if we look at the case of India, in the 80s and 90s, while lots of people going away, they ended up being the same people who are helping set up different types of industries in different areas. I'm not saying that everybody should pack and go. That's not the point. But I'm saying I'm not going to worry because we can't have laws that stop you at customs in your country and ask you where you're going. And if you say you're going to take up a job in vaccine development, that they will sort of detain you or anything of the sort. So you can't stop that from happening. But at the same time, what I do know, and we have people here on the ground who can testify that, is that not everybody wants to relocate. Nobody wants to go and have to live under the bleak English weather, for example. I mean, having said that, over the years, it's become very difficult to spot a blue sky in Nairobi. You might have to go to Accra for that. It's quite gray here, but generally speaking, people prefer to live in their own countries if they can develop the careers they want. They don't want to go anywhere. And when the situation improves for those who are very brave that have stayed on, even those who immigrate tend to come back. And even if they're not coming back, they tend to find pathways to share the knowledge and help build opportunities. So I wouldn't get too stuck on the immigration question because collaboration is important. the world to some extent is global. And then we are also looking towards a situation where, I think, is it 3 or 4 people who are in active economic, sort of production are going to be African in not too the distant future. So in these other countries where they seem to be going, you'll probably mostly have people in retirement, and so on and so forth. And the world will soon become Africa again. So that's all I'm going to say on that.
Thank you, Dr. Wamae. Now, moving to Dr. Chiluba, what role do regional and continental organizations such as Africa CDC play in coordinating vaccine R&D efforts across African nations and promoting collaboration among them?
Yeah, so I'm just from speaking to that a few minutes ago. And for Africa CDC, the first point is we need to make sure that we communicate what the priorities are for the continent. I think every time we look at Africa CDC, we should recognize that this is a continental body that has been created by the African heads of state. And so we need to make sure that as a body, we communicate as effectively as possible. A lot of work has been done in terms of the priorities for the continent. And at that point, it's the best we can do. Can we make sure that all the stakeholders in R&D are aware of what the priorities are for the continent? And based on that, what you'll be noticing quite a lot now is that even when we begin to see where funding is supposed to go as we advocate for funding for R&D, we are able to speak as a continental body and discuss with the funders where we think the priorities are, where the funding should be directed, and which is a very good thing compared to what used to happen, where funding would just come not specific to the continental needs. So I think as I speak, a few weeks ago, we were having consultative meetings with EDCPT, asking Africa CDC where they think the funding should go. If we talk about the workforce development, what kind of skills are we looking for? What the fellowship program should focus on? And this is a very good thing, and researchers on the continent can then leverage on that. But also, one good thing is we have the convening power as a continental body, and so it's easy for us to bring together different stakeholders to discuss the priorities and map the strategy. And so one of the things that we are trying to do is to make sure on our end we have a comprehensive mapping of the R&D institutions, for example, clinical trials centers on the continent, and then we can bring these together to talk to the overall strategy of the continent. So these are some of the things that Africa CDC is trying to do.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Chiluba. So I'll move back to Professor Hill and ask, all the talks today have emphasized that we need to build a skilled workforce. It's essential for sustained vaccine development in Africa. So what strategies can African academic institutions employ to attract, train, and to retain talent in the field of vaccinology?
Yeah, I think one of the obvious things is to make a statement saying that this is a priority area for your institution. And of course, it's a growth area, and it's a really important area. So as we've seen in the last talk, we don't necessarily need huge numbers of these institutions around Africa, but we need some in the east, in the north, in the west, in the south, and centrally as well. So it would be great if individual major universities, University of Nairobi and so on, decided this was one of the priority areas for them, demonstrated that by putting in some seed funding that would hopefully lead to partnerships with other international funders, and got started from there. And you don't need the same strengths in all of those different institutes. You need complementarity, again, as we heard. So I think that would be a great starting point. I was encouraged about, 3 or 4 months ago to go back to the Institut Pasteur at Dakar, and there was a lineup of Senegalese young scientists, maybe 25 or more, every one of whom had been to Europe, North America, somewhere else outside of Africa, who had been trained in Africa as well as outside, and they had come back because there was money for an mRNA hub, somewhat funded by Gates, by other people as well, starting up at what is already a manufacturing center in Dakar in West Africa. So it's important to bring in that money, to draw back the diaspora of people who have trained internationally, bring them together with a fantastic institute, and they're still building there. And that's just one of the maybe 4 or 5 centers I think that we need in Africa. And it's important that everybody doesn't all try and prioritize the same thing. There are lots of different technologies out there. There's no clear winner. That's why there are 5 major technologies, not one. And you're going to need all 5 capacities. So some coordination there as well would be great. But you know, there is a diaspora of people that I see in England and everywhere else that would probably rather be back in Africa with adequate funding and capacity and leadership.
And it's also interesting to note that we are attracting not just Africans to come back, but we're also attracting foreigners to come and establish themselves here. So in a segue to that, Dr. Mwila, so how does CDC then champion this by engaging with governments and policymakers and other stakeholders to secure sustainable funding to support R&D initiatives in Africa?
Yeah, so I think I alluded to this a bit earlier, but I always want to just attach a personal opinion to this in most cases. So Africa CDC established as an autonomous health agency for the African Union member states. And so, like I was saying the other day, the member states themselves, they have to make sure that this agency wins. Okay, so in design, it's a technical agency, and if you look at the experts that it's been assembling, we've got the capacity to conduct studies, research, to inform policy changes and advocate for those policy changes in different countries on the continent. And it's really on our part, the one thing that we are so sure of that we can do. So we do go ahead, conduct the studies, and we publish the information, we generate policy briefs, we convene the member states to disseminate the findings and recommend the policies that needs to be implemented to the member states. And we keep on conducting ourselves as such, advocating for these changes. So ultimately, the member states have to act to the things that they signed to. Okay, so they supported the establishment of the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing. And in the framework for action, we see the budget figures that I was showing. And member states are committed to contributing towards that. They already do make contributions to the African Union, that then some of it goes to Africa CDC for implementation of these activities. But for R&D, this is something that the continent is still struggling in, but it's highlighted in the framework for action. And so, but obviously, Africa being a continent of fewer resources, I think that we have seen a lot of advocacy on the part of the heads of states, lobbying for different funding organizations across the globe to come together and have a look at the priorities for the continent and direct the funding towards these R&D activities. So as Africa CDC, I think number one, like I said earlier, make sure that there's an emphasis on the R&D. And we also do engage with other institutions, secondly, funding institutions, so the foundations, MasterCard Foundation, BMGF as well. And also, I'm sure you hear our DG very often championing what he calls the second independence of Africa, which is Africa being able to manufacture these health commodities on their own, and R&D is going to be very critical for that. And lastly, it's discussions with international funding initiatives like EDCDP, bring them to the table, show what the deficiencies are on the continent, and then direct those conversations towards funding of those activities, and at all cost, making sure that we avoid duplication of effort.
Thank you very much for that. So, Dr. Wamae, let me be a bit controversial and ask, with the Africa Oxford Initiative, the innovation platform, shouldn't this work be led by Africa? What is Oxford doing in the middle of all this?
Yes, that is indeed very controversial. What is Oxford doing in the middle of all this? Is it some form of, I'll also be very controversial, covert imperialism, for example? I mean, Africans are patriotic. The countries are independent, sovereign states. There's talk about a second independence. So indeed, what exactly is Oxford doing in the middle of all this? What I will say is this, that for AfOx, if we were to get to a place where we are not needed at all, that would be a massive success for us. But as you all know, we are talking about building capabilities. We are all talking about how do you develop that expertise. Is there collaborative opportunities in a similar fashion as in research that could be geared towards helping build those capabilities required to develop a vaccine and take it through the valley of death? There might be some rationale there for that, but in all honesty, from the AfOx perspective, if one day we wake up and Africa says we don't need you, well, that would be a big success for AfOx. We can imagine a world where, in fact, the collaborations will be intra-African, so much so that other continents are begging us for collaboration and we are too busy collaborating with each other within the 54, 55 countries. That could be a scenario one might imagine, but the long and short of this is that when it comes to research, and in the same way, when it comes to innovation, when you're dealing with technologies that follow cyclical waves and so on and so forth. You can't get away from collaborations. Even the private sectors collaborate across the globe, not just within their countries, in spite of, worries about intellectual property and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. So, in a brief sentence, what's your parting shot in terms of our efforts to build sustainability in this vaccine ecosystem?
For me, it's straightforward. It's people to help to create that critical mass. This is a good start. I hope in terms of maybe within the next, let's say 5 years, I will not be able to have the statistics, but I would hope that there won't be massive attrition with people going to work for McKinsey or going somewhere else. But it's people.
Thank you. Dr. Mwila, same question. Parting shot.
I think for me, it's what I always try to say, being deliberate about this agenda. So if you look around, I think some of the best documents, strategic documents or policies have been developed on the continent. When you read them, for example, I'll give you an example for the framework for action for the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing. When you read it, it's a brilliant document. I read another document, the business plan for pharmaceutical manufacturing in Africa, developed in 2007. When you read these documents, it sends the signals that the continent understands what needs to be done. They know what the challenges are. We know what we can do to get out of those challenges. It's on the action side. Okay, so in addition to developing the people, in fact, we can't develop even the people if we are not deliberate about it. We know we need the investment. And so as a continent, first of all, even though we have gotten a lot of goodwill from cooperating partners, institutions and countries outside the continent, I think even ourselves, we need to begin to put the money where we are supposed to. So that's going to be the starting point. There's no debate as to what the importance of what we are trying to do in terms of health products manufacturing capacity on the continent is concerned. But if we are not deliberate about it, put investment on it, act on establishing the systems that we have well documented in our documents to see how they can work, then this is going to be a conversation only for many years to come. And I hope I'm wrong. Thank you.
We hope so too. Adrian, same question.
Thanks. I guess it's one recommendation I'm allowed. Look, focus first on what Africa is very good at. And that includes clinical trials and clinical trials of vaccines. We found it very easy to find partners for a malaria vaccine in 4 countries in Africa, and those trials were done absolutely outstandingly for regulatory submission. There are very good centers for phase 3 trials and development. Africa is also very good on the large-scale planning. You've heard about that from Africa's CDC, and that all looks right to me and sensible, and there are opportunities there, and that is happening, and you have very, very good people involved. And I saw just 2 weeks ago, Saudi Arabia wants to spend billions on vaccine R&D. They haven't got the people. Maybe you could help them. There's a partnership there. But the one recommendation is really simple. It's to do with young people and graduate students. and somewhere they can make vaccines. And the metric I would like to see in 5 years, changing from today to 5 years' time, is the number of papers produced on immunizing mice, right? Beginning of the value chain, done by African scientists in Africa, measuring an immune response, measuring efficacy. That's where it all starts. There hasn't been enough focus on getting 24-year-olds excited because they can make a vaccine themselves and somebody to show them how to, and they immunize mice and they get their results. You can see the sparkle in their eyes when that happens. They tell their granny they're making a vaccine for AIDS. You know, it's not untrue, it's just hard. So that's a university responsibility and an institute responsibility. When I tried to start in Nairobi a preclinical plan with ILRI and others in 2007, we didn't have an adequate small animal facility to do that. That's changing, but it needs to change faster. That's where the value in vaccines starts. That's where you make your patent from, the first immunization of mice showing promising data. So as well as the grand plans, you need to be building from the bottom up and putting money in there. And it's not big money, it's small money. Graduate students in Africa and everywhere are underpaid their value for money. So think about that. And if you're not designing immunogens, you're not starting the sequence that will end up with continental manufacture and global supply.
Thank you very much. Now, I can take 2 questions. One male, one female. So we have 2 male and 1 female. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am Salem from Institute Pasteur Dakar. So my question is for, sorry. Okay. Is okay? Okay. So I'm Salem from Institute Pasteur. My question is for the doctor from the Africa CDC. He was talking mainly about R&D, but not about raw material, how we can supply the raw material and the region. We do have many challenges on raw materials supplying for Institute Pasteur because we are doing R&D development. So what's the vision of Africa CDC to have collaboration with all those industries who are making reagent or raw material, bring them here in Africa, and we can have collaboration that they can produce the raw material here in Africa, and that will be easy to supply. Like maybe you order your reagent in the morning, in the evening you have your reagent to optimize the process that we have to do. So what the vision of Africa CDC for this issue? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Sam. I think the reason I did not speak to raw materials is because it wasn't the topic allocated to me. But yes, so Africa CDC is looking at the entire value chain, the entire ecosystem. And so earlier this year, I think starting from last year in collaboration with Chai, we were looking at supplier mapping for raw materials for vaccine manufacturing on the continent. That culminated into a 3-day meeting here in Nairobi earlier this year. I think should be January or February. So the idea is exactly the way you've put it. We recognize the challenges faced by the manufacturers to source these raw materials. So we were trying to conduct a diagnosis and see what kind of raw materials do we have on the continent? What's the potential to manufacture these raw materials? Where are these raw materials coming from? What would be the best way to make sure that the manufacturers have got easy access to these raw materials? So that work is still ongoing, and there's going to be a separate strategy developed on promoting raw material efficient supply on the continent. And as soon as that is available, I'm pretty sure IPD is one of the stakeholders. They will be able to have access to that information. But something is being done about it. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So my question, I really appreciate all of the gaps that you highlighted, essentially, and actually areas that we need to assess different countries or different, like, let's say, regional ecosystems with concern to like the pillars of what it would take to create like a robust manufacturing capacity. So my question is honestly, since if it's possible, maybe that's not information you have at hand, like on the metrics of patent infrastructure, for instance, like systems where it's very easy to be done. Which countries in Africa are the most ready for that? And the other one was, sorry, I think you even talked about, like, let's say human resource. You talked about how you went to Senegal and you saw 25 scientists who had had vast experiences in other places. Like, my question is just centered around if you were to name countries that have high potential to be hubs, because I don't assume that they are all robust in all the different pillars you talked about, but like the ones which are promising in terms of having a high like critical mass of people already, and let's say the patent systems, and then even just like the economical background, the economic background to be able to be in quotes cheap enough to be able to have, you know, animal facilities and to be able to employ people in a way that's of a decent incentive, you know, to be able to, like, where can we start? I think that's my question. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, let me have a crack at that. There's been a lot of discussion of manufacturing. I don't think anybody has spelled out in a sentence what I see as the central problem. And it's very simple. There are about 1.3 billion people in Africa. There are many billions more in Asia. The reason Indian, Korean, Chinese manufacturers can sell vaccines at larger scale and less expensively is they've got about 4 times as many people. And they've got that market in there that they supply. If you're an African Minister of Health, no matter what vaccine manufacturing capacity you build in Africa, he or she is going to have to take the decision someday, do I buy locally produced vaccines more expensively than the same type of vaccine from, say, India or Korea? It's just a matter of numbers. I don't know the answer for that. That's for African governments and people to decide. But that is tough. It really is. To say we'll buy the more expensive vaccine when money is always short. So keep that in mind, that you really probably need some technical advance as well to make vaccines even cheaper if you're going to manufacture in Africa and primarily supply Africa. And that's assuming you're supplying all 54 countries, not just your region. So that is a really big challenge, and I can't see what the immediate solution to that is. As I said earlier, what I would encourage you to do is to build capacity here for inventing new vaccines that start life in Africa. And then what you do is you sell them to India and you take a nice royalty from whatever they're manufacturing. And I'm very confident that Africa can do that.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentations and the gaps that you've highlighted. But my question is, I'm basing it on one book called The Dysfunctions of a Team. And one of the things that they've mentioned is lack of trust. So lack of trust can lead to lack of open communication and collaboration. So we've had instances where we are saying the valley of death. We've had instances where CDC, African CDC, is talking about countries not remitting enough funds into the kitty, to fast track training and competency on vaccines. Prof, you've also mentioned something around, you want to see so many papers on how many, studies on mice. So my question is, what percentage does absence of trust play in realizing our dream of coming up with vaccines in Africa, remembering that we're just 1% of the vaccines are being produced in Africa, and we are talking of 40 to 60% in 2040. Are we going to realize that, considering that there's an aspect of absence of trust among funders, institutions, scientists, and all these collaborators? Thank you.
Maybe I can go first. So the value of trust in the agenda really cannot be overstated. First of all, if you look at the Africa CDC initiative of Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing, it's dealing with partnerships. In the absence of trust, no partnership can exist. I haven't really, this partnership was created, by the way, when we talk about it like this, you might be tempted to think it's been in existence for a long time. It started, the framework for action was published in 2022. And I think from the time it was established, the initiative was scored quite a good number of successes. And that is because there's been significant trust existing between the initiative and a lot of partners. So I wouldn't look at it right now that there's a lack of trust, because we have countless partners as Africa CDC with a lot of MOUs signed, joint action plans established, a lot of work that we are jointly doing with a lot of partners, and a lot of information that I can come here and share with you is not information that has been done solely by Africa CDC, but in collaboration with other partners. So I think in that aspect, it's been going on well. But obviously, if you talk about the other aspect of African countries not allocating enough resources to R&D, we need to have a conversation and discuss what is the reason. I wouldn't put trust at the center of it. It could be an issue of the lack of resources. They are not able to do that at the moment. But these are commitments that have already been made by the member states, and probably at some point they are going to materialize. But I'm not going to put the lack of trust at the center of it, but I recognize that we need to trust each other as partners, because in the absence of trust in this initiative, we put a lot of emphasis on collaboration, So if there is no collaboration between the stakeholders, the funders, then everything can crumble. And so we have to do whatever it takes to grow that trust as much as possible. I think she asked about where is the lot of people or skilled people concentrated on the continent in this conversation. So we did a mapping, I think on Tuesday I mentioned this. So since the COVID-19 pandemic, we did a mapping of vaccine manufacturing initiatives that are sprung up on the continent. So in total, we have 24 that we have counted. 9 of them have facilities. They have installed their facilities, and obviously looking at venturing into the manufacturing processes, but we should also remember that this is a business. When you're having this conversation, this is a business. And so these manufacturers, about 3 of them are ready for technology transfer to receive the technology to start manufacturing. So the message from these manufacturers is what Prof has alluded to. They are looking for the market. Okay, so if they are going to manufacture, where is the market? And see, this is how everything that you see on that wheel in the framework for action for all the enablers fits in. So you have the market shaping program. So we now have to tell the manufacturers that we can guarantee the market, and most of those 9 are indicating that they could put the product on the market in the next 3 years. So now we have to make sure that we create that market when the product gets onto the market. So inevitably you expect that in these regions, these countries, that's where you find even their workforce development initiatives have advanced. So we talk about Senegal, IPD. If you go north, you have Mabio in Morocco, you have Vaxera in Egypt, and you have also biogeneric in Egypt as well. There's also Mina Pharma. And then in South Africa, you've got Biovac, you've got Aspen, you've got Afrigen, the mRNA hub. And then you have those that are coming up, including Rwanda, BioNTech, Atlantic Life Sciences in Ghana, Innovative Biotech in Nigeria, and many newer initiatives that we are seeing coming up. So these, especially the North and the South and the West in IPD, have had initiatives to develop their workforce, but we do know that it's still not enough. And more initiatives to develop the talent is ongoing.
Thank you. Just to come back to the question of trust, it's a very, very pertinent and important question. And it reminded me that, for example, here in Kenya, some years ago, a national research fund was set up in an office to distribute funding. The government, so it wasn't really a question. The government is not able to allocate resources. It even had the equivalent of a research council funder to do that, called the National Research Fund. And it kicked off, maybe the first year it looked good. Then before we knew it, money was not being transferred to the institutions, and then it was being returned to Treasury, and so on and so forth. So trust matters in very many different aspects in terms of creating efficient systems. and having some level of accountability. Why isn't the money being spent? Why is it being returned to Treasury? What is going on? I mean, these are questions that we need to have to look hard in the mirror and engage with them. And, we, as the people, concerned, have to think of ways to engage with those very questions that, tend to sort of be left to one side, because those create blockages. If the system is working efficiently, it's likely to grow and, do much more. Now, the other question is perhaps more relevant to, researchers in the room is, if I want funding as a researcher, applying for grants is very difficult. How do I develop trust? And if you look around across Africa, one would notice that there are African researchers maybe now established their PIs with big grants. They don't seem to really have problems attracting funding. In fact, it's almost as though donors are chasing them around. And you might be thinking, well, how do I get there? And obviously those people didn't start there. Some of them were trained in Africa, began in Africa, and so on. And it starts with the question of trust. You get a small grant, you do a fantastic job. And now you are very lucky, because the Science Africa Foundation gives grants and tries to de-risk that initial element where you're not, an internationally recognized PI yet, but you're getting there very quickly. So it helps to de-risk that. It gives funding and is able to really demonstrate that people, use money sensibly. There are processes that are in place that can deal with that. And so there's some hope. So this is really a starting point, but it's having a small grant, demonstrating you're capable of handling it effectively, and, if you have some deliverables, delivering them, and then step by step getting to the top of the tree, I think. Yeah.
So we'll take one question. I think Harriet. Yeah.
So just in relation to the response that Prof. Adrian gave in terms of capacities in the scenario where we are saying that considering economies of scale of buying vaccines from countries like China or India, where the vaccine would be cheaper, and considering having to invest and produce our own vaccines from the country, being the other countries are cheaper. So I'm just thinking in terms of practicality of, there's a point that was raised in terms of a generation which has to sacrifice for Africa to be stable in that line. Because if we keep on injecting, my thoughts keep on injecting monies into other economies and not allowing money to circulate within our own countries, there is a level of maybe thinking risk or we'll have to take as a continent in terms of allowing us to undergo some losses before we get to the place of being stable, than keeping on injecting monies with the reason of it's cheaper if we get it from India, than incurring the losses currently, and hopefully we'll get to a place of stability to be able to get to a level of producing our own vaccines as a country. So I don't know how practical that is.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that's a very perceptive question. There's an element of biting the bullet that has to be involved. And this is not new, and it does happen in Africa. In fact, in South Africa, that is how they have been able to make strides. Basically, the key point is not to get caught up in this debate that, if they're coming from China or India, they're 10 times cheaper. Is to turn that on its head and think about what we are really trying to do is create the capabilities and the critical mass. So, and have that with a timeline. This is not something that will happen forever. It's not about import substitution as we saw maybe in the 70s and 80s or after independence. This is not the point. This is about building those capabilities. And you can only build those capabilities if you have the opportunities to actually engage in the activities that help you build that. Because as you can imagine, if you're at a university and you're learning and you have some level of maybe lab work that you're doing, etc., that's not all. And the capabilities needed for industry don't match one-on-one what is happening within a university lab, as you saw in what I was explaining during the presentation. You still need companies where you can go and get your hands dirty. And that's how you build the critical capabilities. And again, emphasizing the fact that this should have some sort of timeline, maybe 10 years, 15 years, you try to get to a certain level.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. Just one final comment. I'm not sure if everyone's aware where some of the tension about African manufacturing lack of capacity came from. And that, of course, was during COVID. I think it was March of 2021 when the Delta wave came across to India and really was a huge outbreak within the outbreak in India. And what happened, and you'll understand the tension here, is that the Prime Minister of India, Prime Minister Modi, said, yeah, we've got a lot of manufacturing capacity in India, but while this wave is killing people really quickly in my country, we're not exporting any vaccine. Now, the main vaccine being exported was the one made in Oxford with AstraZeneca and then in the Serum Institute of India. And African governments were faced with anticipating supplying vaccine that had been promised to them, and then the company, because it wasn't running the country in India, couldn't supply Africa, and that lasted, I think, almost 5 months. That hurt. Nobody wants to be there again. There have been all sorts of ideas. I'll just throw out one for dealing with those. And I kind of like this one. I think it came from Bill Gates originally. He said he was going to build 7 manufacturing facilities around the world. Didn't actually happen. But the interesting bit was he was going to put them in the smallest countries in every continent. In Europe, the country first supplied with vaccine for the whole population in Europe was Gibraltar. It's not very big. It's tiny. It was easy. But it does avoid the Modi problem that, you know, he has to get re-elected again. If his people die, that costs him. And there are small countries in every continent. Just a thought when you're building your facilities.
So thank you everyone for that. We'd like to give a little appreciation to our partners. As I said earlier, this Vaccinology in Africa course is usually run by the University of Oxford, and they've been very supportive in us putting this together and this offering. So we'd like to appreciate them. We've also been very cordially hosted by the University of Nairobi, and the VC is here. So we'd also like to appreciate them. And even though there was a little bit of an outbreak in your field visit to the International Livestock Research Institute, we'd also like to appreciate them for providing that opportunity for you. So I'd like to invite Professor Hill and Lisbeth, if you'd like, to take on. So thank you very much for your contribution. If you could hold it up. That's a plaque in appreciation for the Jenner Institute at the University of Oxford. Thank you. Thank you. And if I could invite Professor Kiama and Thumbi to receive for University of Nairobi. And Caroline will receive on behalf of ILRI, which we'll send to them. And then I'll just trouble you a bit more, Professor Kiama, to come up and issue the certificates for the participants. Thank you very much, panelists.
Okay, I've been told to give a few words. I was here at least, I think, when you were beginning. I'm glad to see that we are reaching the end of this conference, and hope that you have been taken care of by those who had been tasked to take care of you when this was going on. But this discussion that has started on vaccines should not end here. I think we should be able to move to realizing it. The University of Nairobi, we have addressed the issue of our vision to globally competitive university, transforming society. And one of the pillars we have put is the issue of innovation. Because here is a lot of time people are trained so that they gather a lot of knowledge and perhaps they go and they use it out there. But we believe that when we still have our students, our masters and our PhD students and undergraduate, they should be engaged in issues like this one we have been discussing here, and even issues of how to get to innovate and come up with vaccines. Because we continue to have, I think if we are going to deal with the health issues, this is the only way to go. Otherwise, we continue to importing, and these issues have come. We continue to import everything, and the little resources we get from the services we offer, we ship them out. So I'm told several countries are represented here. I think 13 of them. So how many? 21 countries. So I believe that therefore the seed that has been planted and then will go and sprout in all those countries. And when you meet next, it will be what has happened since our last training. So it doesn't happen like sometimes happen in churches when some person is preaching, then you think another person is the one who should have received the sermon. Yeah. And be converted. You have been converted yourself. Asante sana. God bless you. Yes.
So I'd like to call Kameni Georgette Njila. Harriet Oboge. Gededi Gededi. Faith Ndungu. Christian Dekezi. Kalisile. Birhanu. Bernadette Ataku. Abiot. Zinabu. Samuel Tezera. Patrick Musole. Oluwole Christopher. Ndeye Kumba. Christopher. Mohammed Conte Barat. Mark Ewusi Shibura. Arthur Watelo. Abdulaziz. Jetel. Rosombati. Osman Ba. Noah Herbert Paul. Natalie Sang. Ghana Salem. Martha Mandale. Letta Abera. Kenneth. Joanne Chick. Hannah Chege. Godfrey Tudor. Zione Diembo. Dembo, sorry. Ethel Webby. Bright Adolebi. Adobli. Sorry, Bright. Oh, sorry. Zione. Yeah.
So this is the one which is yours, I think.
No, no, no.
Okay.
There's, yeah. Zione.
Okay. This is what?
Zione.
Zione. Ah, then you have to take it.
And Bernadette Carter. For the two from Kevi Vapi, we'll be issuing yours. There's one more person who will send as well. So I'd like to invite everyone to the front for a group photo, including the panelists. If I could have Professor Hill, Dr. Wamae, Professor Kiama, and Dr. Mwila sitting at the front. Yeah, thank you.
Ah, mon compatriote, ça va? Félicitations à toi.